welcome. It's quite a privilege to be part of this experiment, to be both live, and it's great to see so many people live and also on Zoom. And thank you to Mike for the introduction. Oops, oh yes. There were three periods before the Civil War, and I've covered Grant's childhood and West Point and part of the army. I finished my talk last year at the point at which hostilities ceased. And I'm going to cover from that point and through to what are often referred to as the wilderness years. I'm going to take you first of all, and I'm sorry to those people that are watching, I apologise to those people watching on Zoom. I've got a laser pointer, but you won't be able to pick that up. So it's worthwhile just going back to this map of the Civil War, and you will see that Grant was involved with Zachary Taylor in crossing the border and making their way to Palo Alto and Matamoros, both of which had major battles, and then going inland up to Monterey and Saltillo. And the dates of those battles are included on this particular map, which you'll be able to pick up hopefully from the recording. At the same time, Kearney left Fort Leavenworth and proceeded overland to Santa Fe, and there was a battle at Santa Fe on August the 18th, whatever it is, I can't see it at the moment, but it's a little bit blurred and I can't remember. At that particular point, there was a split in the army, and Kearney continued along and through with various battles to San Diego, and also at that time Doniphan proceeded down from north of the 1828 boundary through to Sonoma and Sutter's Fort and down to the other Monterey, where they took ship and went to Santa Barbara. There was a battle at Santa Barbara, and again by ship, where they joined up with Kearney at San Diego. When they split at Santa Fe, they went down through the country to El Bracito, and there was a battle there, through to Sacramento, another battle there, and Doniphan joined up with Taylor at Saltillo. At the end of the conclusion of the hostilities in this area, they proceeded back to Matamoros and the coast, where they were joined by Old Fuss and Feathers, who then wanted to get the glory of winning the war in Mexico, and they proceeded by sea to Veracruz. Here's a picture of Grant in his second lieutenant's uniform. I think you, the ladies present, probably the gentlemen too, would agree that he was a good-looking man in his uniform. And I'm going to cover the remainder of Grant's time in the army and the wilderness years. The time in Mexico following cessation of hostilities. One of the things that he did was to travel the country as there was no further hostilities, and he joined some of his army colleagues in a trip up Popocatépetl. And I thought this was such a beautiful photograph that we couldn't not include it here. I'm not sure what the building is in front, but it looks like some sort of religious building. After the conclusion of hostilities, the hostilities concluded on the 14th of September, 1847. On the 16th of September, Grant's first lieutenant position was made permanent, More importantly, it was backdated to the 8th for his gallant and meritorious conduct at the Battle of Molino del Rey, which was just outside Mexico City. However, he was still a brevet captain at that particular time. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on the 2nd of February 1848 and ratified on the 30th of May 1848, a period of non-hostilities of about 8 months. So he had lots of time to go and explore and look at Mexico itself. And he commented, Grant, that it was one of the most beautiful countries with an ideal climate for his particular temperament. And indicating that, he said it was one of the happiest that he'd spent in the whole of his life, as there he was a quartermaster, so he was kept busy. He always enjoyed being occupied. And after the signing of the agreement and coming into force, the army marched out of Mexico City, and there was a ceremonial departure from that particular place. And Grant boarded ship for the Mississippi. I think it's worth covering some of the interesting statistics that took place between 1802 and 1847. 1802 was when West Point was founded. There were 1,365 graduates from West Point. Over 33%, or a third, had left the army. And of the remainder, 286, that's 20% of the total output of West Point perished in Mexico. I think that's frighteningly high, personally. He was familiar with some of the senior officers, particularly Henry W. Halleck, and that's a name, obviously, that's associated particularly with the Civil War, and I hesitate to say infamous, but there are reasons why I would like to, George B. McClellan. Grant's friends included Thomas J. Jackson and D.H. Hill, as well as Longstreet, Braxton Bragg, and Joseph E. Johnston. We'll hear more of Longstreet in a few moments. And in particular, Grant commented on how much he admired Robert E. Lee and Joseph Hooker. When they returned, Grant was given 2 months' leave. What happened? Grant married Julia Dent. You may or may not remember from last year that Frederick Dent, or Fred as he was normally called, was his roommate in his final year at West Point. And he met Julia at the family home called Whitehaven because of the demand that Fred said, you must come and visit the family when you're down at St. Louis. Grant married Julia on the 22nd of August, 1848, and after leave returned to Jefferson Barracks, which was about 12 miles away from Whitehaven. Longstreet was Sam's best man. Just so you're familiar, Grant was often referred to by all his friends as Sam, rather than Ulysses or S. The S stood actually at his christening for Simpson, which was the family name. And Longstreet was Sam's best man and also Julia's cousin. The ushers at his wedding were Cadmus Wilcox and Bernard Pratt. And it's of particular note that all of these three surrendered to Grant at Appomattox at the conclusion of the Civil War. So after his wedding and returning from leave, he got back into normal life. The 4th Infantry was given border duty at Madison Barracks in Detroit. And the Sackets Harbour Barracks is still there. And this is a picture, although the barracks is no longer used for army purposes, all of the buildings that are there have been maintained and used. There are restaurants, shops, etc., and apartments being built. During this time, it's important to me that he was able to take Julia with him on this particular posting. So he was very happy in the company of his wife. He was a faithful husband throughout their married life. Even when he was down in Mexico and away from her, he was faithful to her, while there was a lot of other soldiers and officers who were perhaps not quite so faithful. I've managed to find a picture of an inspection at the barracks. It's quite an interesting building, as you can see, and well built, and has survived hundreds of years now. And this is just an inspection that took place around about the turn of the 20th century. In the background of the previous building, we saw this water tower that was built. And I thought, again, it's quite a cold place up on Lake Ontario. During this time, Grant was noted for the things that he did in his activities. He loved racing horses. He was noted for his horsemanship, which had been one of his real delights over the years. He was an extremely good horseman and showed that off when he graduated at West Point. He was also noted for playing checkers. At the time, his commanding officer was Colonel Whistler, who was unaware that Grant had been made a permanent quartermaster in Mexico. The garrison commander at the barracks was Colonel Francis Lee, who was a friend of Grant's from Mexico and supported the representation that Grant made. Colonel Whistler was not a vindictive man, just unaware of what had happened in Mexico. After representations and being made quartermaster, Grant was ordered back to Detroit, but he overwintered at Madison Barracks due to the lakes being frozen. This is a picture of one of the islands where the army could be based, and it's probably Horse Island, just off the coast in Lake Ontario. Okay, let me just go. Okay. This was an ideal time for both Grant and Julia. They had a wonderful time together. Obviously, in those days, families arrived within relatively short periods after being married. On March the 2nd, 1849, Grant received orders to return to Detroit as quartermaster. Julia visited, and this is a picture of the Detroit barracks. Again, the buildings are beautifully maintained over there, and this is some function that was taking place of a celebratory nature of the barracks itself. After they returned, Julia visited Grant's parents on her way back to Whitehaven, just outside St. Louis. And this was, as I've said, the Dent family home. Army life for Grant became mundane. As a quartermaster, he needed the paperwork skills, and he considered himself not to be any good as a clerk. This is a picture of the Fort Niagara. The War Department decided to reduce the size of the installation at Detroit, and Colonel Whistler chose Madison Barracks as the location rather than at Fort Niagara. But the second assignment to Sackets Harbour was short-lived for Grant. In the spring of 1852, the 4th Infantry were ordered to the west coast because of the gold rush. The posting to California was a watershed for Grant. Julia was heavily pregnant, so could not travel with him, and they parted on the 15th of June, 1852. On the 5th of July, 1852, less than 3 weeks later, he set sail from New York to Panama. At this time, Grant was very busy as quartermaster. Here's a picture of the ship that on which they sailed from New York. And I thank Peter, who was able to find a picture of the ship for me, obviously with his naval interest and connections. However, the ship was horribly overcrowded. It normally had 330 passengers, but on this trip it had 1,100. The army were billeted on deck for the 10-day journey, and seasickness was rife. When they disembarked, the troops were considerably weakened, and there was cholera epidemic on the coast. Grant lost numerous troops to the disease on the journey across the isthmus to Panama City, where the disease was even more rampant. It's noted that during the trip across, which was, he couldn't get the transports that had been arranged for him by the War Department. And so he had to arrange all of that himself with local organisers. And he had to bury those people that died along the roadside. And my understanding is that there are still graves that are viewable of soldiers that were buried on that horrendous journey across the isthmus. When they arrived at Panama City, Grant established a hospital on Flamingo Island, and the worst cases of cholera were isolated on a ship in the harbour. In August, 450 of the remaining troops boarded the Golden Gate ship. Again, a wonderful, I think it's a watercolour or print, but another sidewheeler. And they set sail for San Francisco. They docked on the 17th of August that year. In 1848, the California population was 20,000. It was admitted to the Union in 1850, and the population was growing at that time by 50,000 annually. On his first night ashore, Grant won $40 gambling and treated himself to a slap-up meal. I've no doubt that that was a consolation for him, because I've no doubt that the food on board ship was not particularly exciting. The 4th Infantry remained in San Francisco for 4 weeks, and Grant visited Julia Dent's, his wife's brothers, who were prospering in business at San Francisco. And in mid-September, the 4th Infantry boarded ship for Fort Columbia, and this was later named Fort Vancouver, which was on the Columbia River. This is the military headquarters at Fort Columbia, now I believe a restaurant. I think one of the things that is notable is that the Americans particularly like to preserve all of these establishments, even if they don't use them for military purposes. Grant was not able to move his family to be with him for financial reasons. The cost of living at the time of the gold rush meant that it was horrendously expensive to live over there. Grant undertook several business ventures which failed and were outside his control. The farming projects in particular were dogged by bad weather, with crops rotting in the ground. Grant was also too trusting of others and went into a sutler's business with Elijah Camp. Camp offered to buy out Grant after a month for the cost of Grant's initial investment of $1,500 with an unsecured note. Camp disappeared. In 1853, he went into business with Wallen and Ruth Ingalls, both West Point classmates. On one venture, they sent a boatload of ice to San Francisco because it was in great demand, but because of unfavourable winds, the ice melted before it could be landed. Now that sounds very amusing, but must have cost a fortune for the three venturers. In the spring of 1853, Grant planted potatoes, onions, and corn. He ploughed the land himself, having paid enlisted men to clear the underbrush. He also bought a large quantity of timber. Unfortunately, the weather struck again. The river flooded and washed away the crops and the timber. Grant longed for Julia and the children. He indulged in 2 or 3 drinking sprees a year. In 1853, the sprees became more frequent. George B. McClellan had been assigned to do a survey of the Cascade Range of mountains for the Northern Pacific Railway and was offended by Grant, who he knew from the Mexican War, and for his drinking sprees. When it came, Grant never failed to provide Mac with what he required, despite the drinking sprees. Mac had gained prominence for his survey of the Red River and Texas coast. Grant had been a temporary captain since 1851 and was next in line for a permanent position. In anticipation, Grant resigned as regimental quartermaster and then received his appointment. Jefferson Davis, named for the future, instructed him to join his new Company F at Fort Humboldt. For me, this looks a desolate place, Fort Humboldt. The commanding officer at Fort Humboldt was a brevet captain, Lieutenant Colonel Robert C. Buchanan, described as old army, being a very good soldier, but a martinet. Grant was dubious about the appointment, as there were no family quarters there either. It took 3 months to settle up at Fort Vancouver, and Grant was ill for the first time in years. On about the 10th of April, 1854, Grant submitted his resignation. Why did Grant resign his commission? Was he inebriated, as was suggested? Was he forced or given no acceptable alternative? Here's a picture. I'll answer those questions in a moment. Here's a picture of Grant at the time. He'd grown a rather voluminous beard. Unfortunately, this black and white picture doesn't show off the ginger nature and colour of this particular beard. Grant was forced by his commanding officer to resign. He was given virtually no alternative. It was resign or face a court-martial. I think it's pretty certain that he was inebriated at the pay desk when he was caught by Buchanan. His resignation became effective on the 31st of July that year. Grant arrived in New York on the 25th of June, 1854, dejected and penniless. He'd had to pay his own expenses in returning from California. And in New York, Grant borrowed money from Simon Oliver. He also tried to collect his debts from Elijah Camp at Sackets Harbour, but Camp had left town before Grant arrived. Julia had a small farm near St. Louis, given to her as a wedding present by her father. He built a house and cleared the land. The house was facetiously called Hardscrabble by the couple. In 1858, Grant sold all the farming equipment and sold wood only to make ends meet. Grant swallowed his pride at that time and asked his father for a loan, but it was not sent. He tried to find a job in St. Louis, and eventually his father-in-law helped him secure a job with Harry Boggs, a nephew who had married one of Julia's sisters, in a real estate business. In the week, Grant lodged with Harry and Louisa and was described as being domestic and homelike. He rarely smiled and never laughed out loud. On Saturdays, he walked the 12 miles to Whitehaven, and on Sunday he walked back. Grant was too tender-hearted to be a rent collector and too candid to sell real estate, described by a lawyer as being unsuited for business, but a more honest and more generous man never lived. Grant even sold Hardscrabble at a loss and took a $3,000 note for the difference. Grant had acquired a slave at this time from his father-in-law, named William Jones, and was the only slave he ever owned. On the 29th of March, 1859, Grant set Jones free, but could have sold him for $1,000, money he really needed. Grant did not take alcohol at all at this time. When he met former Army colleagues, Grant repaid a $5 debt to Longstreet, even though he could have ill afford to do it. The next time they met was at Appomattox, and Grant was very friendly towards him. By the autumn of 1858, Grant had had enough. The return of the chills and fever of his youth crippled him. Eventually, Grant asked his father for a job. Oops, come along. He had already applied for a position of county engineer. He became a clerk in the US Custom House at $1,200 a year, well paid, but quickly lost that job due to political change. He was behind with the rent and deep in debt. In April 1860, Grant was 38 years old. He asked his father for a job, encouraged by Julia to do so. He departed for Galena, where the business of Jesse's business was, in May 1860. He was paid by Jesse, his father, $600 per annum, and Jesse employed over 50 people in his business. But Grant did not enjoy working in the shop, but there was no bossing of Simpson and Orville, his younger brothers, who also worked in the business. However, the worst was over. Grant paid all his debts by the end of 1860 and was solvent for the first time in years. Grant still avoided alcohol, but smoked to excess. On the 20th of December, Lincoln was elected. Subsequently, South Carolina seceded. The Buchanan administration dithered. They weren't sure what to do and really passed the buck to Lincoln when he took office. Grant declined the captaincy of the Galena Volunteers, but he did prepare the Galena Company for service and was constantly busy. Something that he really enjoyed doing was being occupied. Congressman Elihu Washburn urged Grant to stay in Springfield, for a few more days and everything would work out. Washburn agreed to speak to Governor Yates on his behalf. When Grant was about to catch the train home, as he'd given up waiting, Yates was able to give him a temporary assignment and paid $3 per day. On the 23rd of May, he took leave from Yates to visit Galena. Grant felt rejected, but had decided to write to Washington to a friend of his from Mexico, but never got a reply. He was snubbed by George B. McClellan at Springfield. He'd gone to the offices where George B. McClellan was based on at least 3 separate occasions and waited hours for McClellan to return. Obviously, McClellan had memories of what had taken place in California. He left Springfield at the end of the week to visit a friend. Governor Yates' telegram arrived offering him command of the 21st Illinois Infantry Regiment. And the rest is history. So what has all this life experience done for Grant, both in and out of the army? The army gave him confidence and self-reliance. He was always popular and respected. He always provided for his family, and this came first. And more importantly for the future, he always focused on the outcome. Liked to be busy and occupied. This is a picture of him slightly later, face that we're all familiar with.